Thank you for joining me. First of all, it's really nice to have you here. This is the first in a series of monthly talks about my academic PhD research into UK feminist cartoons and comics since the 70s and the role of humour, on which this book is based. So this initiative, along with my current online cartooning, is supported by an Arts Council England emergency grant for individuals. So thank you to the Arts Council. So just to be clear, this is an academic publication, and so this is an educational talk. It's not for profit for me, which might surprise you, those of you who know me. So authors of academic books don't usually make any money from sales. So if you are affiliated with a university or college, the best thing to do is order this book for your library. That would be a good idea. And please email me if you'd be interested in reviewing the book or accessing it for your personal research, and I'll help you get a copy. So I'm really grateful to all the contributors to my research, many of whom hopefully are here, seen some of your names. And there have been many, and there's been a lot of goodwill involved. So it's been a nice process. All the images that I'm including here are copyright the artists, and I've credited where possible. On we go. Why publish an academic book? This is a tweet I came across this week, and that's only the readers, 34 people. So I guess for me, the reason to publish my research as an academic book is because academia is one of the areas of feminist activism. So it was only in the 80s in the UK that women's studies entered the academia. And so my PhD is actually in gender studies, which didn't even exist as a subject when I was born in 1963. So it's about adding my research to the educational archive to women's and feminist history and theory. And why then have this talk? Well, it's because sometimes, in spite of, being important, academic work gets swept up in its own bubble, or has a potential to. And it's always been really important to me to try to to get the ideas and the research as wide as possible. So that's the challenge for me. And certainly, we've already done this with The Inking Woman, which was I co-edited with Kath Tate, and this is the first illustrated history of UK women's comics for a general reader. So it also functioned as a catalogue for the exhibition. So that's an important documentation. My contribution to that book was drawing on my research, but it didn't really engage in the theory and the in-depth, which is what I hope to do in the book, which I've done, and what I hope to touch on a bit in the talks over the series of talks over the weeks. So I guess when I started my PhD in 2013, I think it was, the basic question in my head was, where are the women? And rather simplistically, or where are the women in comics? And this signposts back to Linda Nocklin's seminal 1970s essay. What was so innovative in her approach was that in response to this idea that there's no women's artwork because women are inferior biologically to men, she addressed that in the context of political, economic and social context. So that was what was innovative about her approach, and that's a similar methodology, I guess, to what I approached this history. So this history of women's comics in the UK. So why the importance, why the need for a history for this? Well, again, because I'm a comics artist and I'm based in the UK. So if I'm going to align my activity, whether it's academic research or my artwork in a history, I need the history to be there, and if it's not there, then I'm not there. So it's all about me. So but why a history? Why a history in the UK? And this is because I've been, you know, I've been within academia since 2008 and presenting in academic conferences since then. And I talked about the Americans, the first American women comics, the first women's comics anthology and all this. And I completely influenced by the work of Trina Robbins and her written histories of women's comics, and it certainly opened my eyes because I kind of assumed that there weren't historically any women making comics or reading them, and so she certainly researched that and spelt it out for us. So I guess what we needed, I felt, was a Trina Robbins for the UK. Because at a certain point, it occurred to me that, well, this is really fascinating what she's writing, but it just isn't my history. I can't be part of the books she's writing because it's in an American context. So like Trina, I'm a creator, she's a creator and a historian. I too am a creator and historian. What's different in what I have done is I've included a critical theoretical interpretation, and I've kept the focus on the UK. What's really significant to me, though, is that when Trina Robbins her first cartooning work was for a feminist periodical, so it was for the first West Coast women's liberation newspaper. So it's one of the findings from my research is that it's feminist activity that's created platforms for women cartoonists and comics to get published and to make work. So when I began, and I think we've got Susie Varty with us here. So I had heard of these initiatives, in particular Susie Varty. So every time I said I'm going to look at women's, oh yes, Susie Varty, the first women's comic in the UK. And again, perhaps I wonder, it's also Susie was very, was one of the few, one of the few women who collaborated with Trina Robbins and took part in the American anthology, and likewise Trina worked with works that Susie led and edited. So that's, or perhaps why Susie is already documented in the histories. Fanny Comics and Sour Cream I knew about, but only really on the periphery at the beginning. And also it was hard to find copies of, for example, Sour Cream and Fanny. And what transpired was that a lot of the archival material that I came across, that I managed to look at, was found in personal archives of women cartoonists who have contributed to my research. And that's been really interesting. It's not what I would have assumed when I started. And so what else? So Dr. Mel Gibson is, I knew that she has been researching all this time and continues to research on girls' comics in Britain. And again, that's that ticked, that area, and also not really my knowledge or interest. And I know that Dr. Joan Omrod is also very keen on Wonder Woman and the idea of superheroes. So there's that contribution in comic studies. In further back history, Mary Daly we now recognise as the first caricaturist, British caricaturist, and Mary Duval, who drew the first comic, Ali Sloper, and that's an amazing archive that's been produced by Dr. Simon Gren and Professor Roger Sabin and Dr. Julian Waite, and I think Roger and Simon might be here with us. So that's been done, that deep history. So there was definitely a gap when I began and for a research into UK women's comics. But then as I started thinking about it, what came to mind comics or that I had been exposed to growing up in the 70s and 80s, and in particular Annie Lawson. But then I came into this problem of the definition of the comic, because in the years all through my master's, I'd used Roger Sabin's definition of what a comic is. It seemed neat and tidy and dictionary-like and did the job. But suddenly it wasn't really comics in this way sequence that was coming to mind. And although, and so again, I turned to Trina Robbins and I noticed that she'd tweaked the definition and And I thought, well, okay, I'm going to change the definition too. And it also made me think, and who is making these definitions? Who's to say what's what? But I certainly added women's cartoons and comics. And then this is an authentic photo from my research. This is a Jackie Fleming postcard in a plastic thing that's in the archives. So again, I was thinking back to my own experience of comics and cartoons, and I realized that actually you know, those, I don't know if people say, oh, what's the first the informative or formative feminist text that you've read? And I kind of knew about Germaine Greer and so on growing up, but it was actually, I think I got a lot of my consciousness raising from Jackie Fleming cartoons and Annie Lawson to a certain extent. So again, I suddenly realized, well, it's not just women's comics and cartoons, it's more specific than that, it's feminist. And here I have to add a note, a clarification, because quite a few of the works that I've included in my research are by women who don't identify as feminists quite clearly, and really don't want to be involved in women-only activity in that sense, in some cases. But actually my research is about my interpretation of their comic work. So they may not identify as feminists, but if their work identifies as feminist, then it's in my research and I can write about it, even if I can't show the work. So it's the feminist lens, often because of the subject matter. And the more I looked through feminist archives, once I had that feminist bit in my title, the more I realized that feminist literature was full of comics by women. And, you know, we refer to, so for example, Spare Rib, every issue of Spare Rib carried one-panel cartoons and also comic strips and even full-page comics. Feminist Review was the academic journal that was launched in 1979, and that carried cartoons as well. So what we might refer to as second wave feminist activity starting in the 60s and really focusing on the 70s, a lot of activity and protest and changes, and it's this activity that began providing platforms for women to publish cartoons and comics, places for cartoons, comics to be. So again, I added that parameter to my work from the 70s. And I divided my research into decades, 70s, 80s. It's very artificial, it's very false, because of course there were overlaps into the decades, but it's convenient. So it's a little bit like the panels of a comic in boxes. Again, as I was looking through the archives, this is a Ros Asquith cartoon, I realized actually my consciousness raising through cartoons wasn't just cartoons, it was funny cartoons. And it was funny that I got, that I enjoyed. And my realization was that humor has been an integral part of feminist activity, and it's one area that's been apparent since the 70s in cartoons and comics, and that hasn't really been documented before in the UK. Well, actually, there is an element that has. Diane Atkinson put on an exhibition and a catalogue called Funny Girls Cartooning for Equality in 1997, and quite a few of the cartoonists that she included I've looked at in my research. Again, it's a great book, and it was themed, so that's different to what I've done, and it only went up to 1997, so I went beyond that. And also it's not theoretical, she hasn't applied theory in her interpretation. So the funny thing was that my focus until then had been on trauma and memoir. So you know, my graphic memoir is based on trauma, and yet the more I thought about it, my own experience of trauma, the more I thought of that experience of laughing through tears, this combination of pain and pleasure. But really, the theoretical springboard in a way for my PhD research, theory was Hilary Shute's Graphic Women. And it was the first theoretical work on women's comics to appear, and in it she analyzes 5 long-form works drawing on trauma theory and feminism, and all 4 of them are by North American artists, and one is Marjane Satrapi, is Iranian, based in France. So she, but I did then have a question about this, and it was a question that I thought, oh, this is how I can add to this conversation, this academic conversation. So I guess what I wondered is that such a focus might imply that to make, because it was the first book on women's work, the implication might be that that women, if women make comics, they have to be autobiographical and they have to be about traumatic experiences. So on the one hand, trauma or tragedy is momentous and of great symbolic value in the West, in our society. It's heavy, it's serious, and so therefore if women's work is about tragedy and trauma, then that means it's going to be taken seriously. However, a tragedy or a trauma is something that happens to somebody, and the traumatized person is positioned in opposition to the untraumatized. In other words, positioned as other, potentially as other or lesser, as victim. So the woman who experiences trauma is a victim of trauma. If that woman then presents her trauma as autobiographical narrative, it's a victim's autobiographical narrative. So my proposal to this conversation, this area, is that this risks being viewed as causal. In other words, that women who make comics must be making comics about autobiographical trauma. Ergo, women and comics are the testimonies of victims. So the serious element in turn becomes conflated with humorlessness. Hence, the woman comics artist becomes associated with a humorless victim. It's only a kind of way of thinking, but I just thought that's where the humor can come in, and that's what I can focus on. So my difference to Hilary Shute is that I'm looking in you looked in a UK context, not just at long form works, but also cartoons, strips, posters, and within a theoretical framework of feminism and humor theory. So, you know, why this interest in humor? And just to remind you that the Ukraine's president is a former comedian, and Boris Johnson is also a former comedian, or maybe still a comedian. So I think what that suggests is the power of humor that we perhaps underestimate. And I invite you to reflect on how Theresa May would have been treated and viewed if she had behaved with the buffoonery that Boris Johnson displayed. So in other words, humor, we read, it's good for us. It's actually literally good for our health. It's a bonding thing. It's essential for romance. It's transcendent of politics, yet really politically useful. And to be able to confidently tell a joke in a speech is a sign of good leadership. So that's sort of the power thing. What it made me think then is, if you're considered humorless, you're considered to be lacking in some way. So what is humor? There's perhaps a tendency to assume that a sense of humor is something innate, something that we're born with, but it absolutely isn't. It's so clearly culturally determined. And I think we only have to, I know I've been thinking back to what I laughed at 20 years ago, and I'm horrified when I watch it now. So it dates very quickly, which suggests it's not something that's permanent or fixed. So what is it? And this is a theorist, John Morreale, who says laughter results, or humor, we should say, laughter results from a pleasant psychological shift. So what he's saying, arguing, is that, first of all, humor doesn't have to result in laughter. It can be, but it does have to result in a pleasant experience. And it's the psychological shift he refers to is that idea of getting a joke. So it's not the shift itself, but it's after the shift that brings us this pleasure. So there's no single theory of humour, but I wanted to just talk you through the three historical basic ones, which all again overlap and inform more modern thoughts and ideas. So the superiority theory was very popular until the 18th century, and the sudden glory is this idea of when the pleasure or the joke is on someone when you feel superior. So for example, it was often the rich laughing at the poor. That was considered very funny, and the feeling of superiority, this laughter was a way of reinforcing the power and superiority of one group over another. So it created a malicious or aggressive laughter. It's kind of, it makes me think of bullying in a playground. So it's at the expense, laughter or humor at the expense of someone else. And if according to superiority theory, social power is assumed to be masculine, then women are located as a less powerful group and therefore become the butt of humor. So we can see this in relation to women. One is through stereotypes, and one of the most aggressive and way of this hostile type of humor, savage, was the anti-suffragette cartoons. So this implication is basically the implication of these visuals, which were really everywhere at the early 1910s time, was that really the implication was that suffragettes were only suffragettes because they were too ugly to get married or too old. And of course marriage was the aim for women in those days. And so what interests me is the way that visually they're portrayed as downturned mouths and frowns. So it's humorless is equated with ugliness. And so Umberto Eco talked about the reversal of the humor. The poor shall turn and laugh at the powerful. And if we this compelling weapon that can be turned on against the ruling classes. So that's in terms of class, but if we apply this idea to women in theory, this reversal strategy, they could destabilize the power dynamics through humor. And this is what the suffragettes produced as their humorous comics or cartoons. And their laughter was not really at a group of people, but actually it was at the system. So it was more satirical. And then the next type of humor I want to look at is incongruity, which Carol says has the power to violate and disrupt norms. And this idea maintains that humor took place between two reference frames. So it was like a normal reality and then an absurd one. And again, there's this switch, this shift, and that's when it becomes funny. But this type of humor was more cerebral. It's more about solving the problem. So that's the joy, is when, oh yeah, I get it, rather than an aggressive form of humor. So I really, really like this cartoon that I found, which is a great example of this, by Angela Martin. And she takes us through, she takes us through a rather sophisticated process of double incongruity. And in doing so, she challenges the stereotype of the objectified woman by satirizing classic Hollywood cinema's reliance on this representation. So immediately, in order to start getting the joke, we have to recognize her reference, which is to King Kong, which in itself is kind of ridiculous. And Michael Mulkey, a theorist, says when we engage with humor, we have different plausibility requirements. So we don't question the idea of a gigantic ape coming through New York. We just take that and then we switch it round. So we don't concern ourselves with the disbelief, the unreal bit. Our concern is interpreting it. And so she clasps her enormous body, woman's body, around this phallic skyscraper, dangling this small ape. And quite interestingly, she's showing bending the skyscraper. So symbolically, she's bending the power of the reversal of roles. So I think Kathleen Rowe talks about the lingering, empowering effect of the sign of the woman on top. And then finally, I want to look at the relief theory of humour. And this is perhaps, maybe we're quite familiar with this because it was made famous, I guess, by Freud, but earlier Spencer. So this idea is that laughter is not associated with stigma or irrationality or superiority. It's about a physical, psychological relief from the social strain of repressing taboo desires. So Freud talked about a tendacious joke, which explained why we laugh at obscene jokes, which are often insulting and wounding. So it's a way that we let out the pent out energy that's needed to repress taboos in day-to-day, taboo ideas. So I wonder, maybe it explains when we sometimes laugh, or maybe it's just me, laugh out loud kind of inappropriately and then realize it's a terrible and offensive joke. Who knows? So, but here I think also, and the shift can be seen in this release of the energies. But sometimes perhaps this type of relief offers emotional relief when the joke isn't offensive, when it's not hostile or sexual, but when the humor may revolve around illness or death, so which might have taboos associated with them. So I've taken an example from my own work. So it's this idea that laughter or the humor releases the nervous energy from emotions considered inappropriate. So I'll talk you through this page from my book, which dictates that the reader's appropriate emotion should be of pity towards the bereaved mother. But as she begins, as we see her grading the responses repeated in each panel, the reader begins to reinterpret the situation. And then there's a shift where the reader, the understanding of the woman as a pitiful victim changes as we see her reappraising, judging the well-wishers, and the energies of the reader's emotions for the grieving mother become pointless. So the mother doesn't need the reader's pity. She doesn't need that form of empathy. And so it's the energy needed for that is released in laughter. And Carol refers to this laughter of relief as a feeling of levity, a lightness from a potential difficulty, a letting go as a bodily transformation, even if it's only a small smile. So again, it doesn't have to involve laughter. Still, I wondered, one of my early questions was still, why has there been this persistent stereotype of the humorless feminist? Perhaps it's less today, but still it seems to have persisted, certainly from the suffragettes to the 70s, very successfully. And this, my light bulb on the cover of the book is a reference to the famous 1970s joke, is how many feminists does it take to change a light bulb? That's not funny. So what happened? And I really enjoyed following Sara Ahmed's thought process to explain this. So she wrote a book called The Promise of Happiness, and she wrote about how we're constantly, I mean, I'm quite the first to click on any kind of Facebook link that says how to be happy or what is the secret of happiness. So I think we have it around us, these latest survey that shows what happiness, how to become fulfilled and happy. So one of the things that she points out always turns up in those surveys is marriage. So, you know, there's always this married people are happier. So what happens is that we start to conflate this. We read the surveys and in our minds, we conflate it with, if you're married, you'll be happier, which actually isn't what the surveys say. And what happens was, and this was written before same-sex marriage was legalized, but it's also, there's an implication that it refers to heterosexual marriage. So therefore, to be married becomes conflated with the route to happiness. And what she asks is, well, what happens if you don't share that socially assumed route to happiness? For example, if you don't want to be married, or taking that as one of the examples. And she then cites Darla Shine's Happy Housewife Club. And Darla Shine, this was 2005, so it's quite old, but she said, grow up, shut up and count your blessings. So if anyone questions it and says, well, you know, is there another way, that kind of thing, for example, a feminist, they're told that they're envious happiness failures because they don't want to settle down and become housewives. Even in 2005, they're just envious and they're just trying to spoil the fun for everybody else. So, and then I just thought I'd have a little cartoon interlude because I was looking through some of the comics in my research. So happy, happy, happy. How do we get happy? So we already saw earlier how suffragettes were stereotyped in a similar way, the visual link between ugliness and humorless, or between only being feminists because they can't get married. But what's amazing is how this continued through to the 70s, or, you know, even 2005, this idea. And as Sian Nagai says, it's not anger that the feminists have been blamed of, because anger is actually a very grand emotion. It's envy, which is a really quite harmful image of feminism. And so even in the 70s, we see the visual depiction of anger as ugly and ugly as humorless. So this equation with humorless or feminists as angry as ugly. So here is a 1973 cartoon. So feminists are too angry or envious, too ugly or humorless, but so what? Who cares if feminists are considered humorless? And this takes me back to this idea of humor as a weapon. And so if we say that women are not funny, they can't use that weapon. So what should be done to gain power is to create humor by forming a group who laugh at your jokes. And visually, this is what includes cartoons and comics. So of course, if you're being laughed at yourself, why would you laugh if it's offensive? But if you create your own group to laugh at your things that you find funny, that's going to build a community to you know, work against that, to create your own power group. So this is a cartoon by Grizelda. So I'm going to come on now to my findings, which I said before that I looked at decades, and in the forthcoming talks each month I'm going to look in more detail at the 70s, 80s, 90s and 2000s, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview here. So in the 1970s there was, and so in the 1970s the trope of the humor was very clearly one of anger of the feminist humor, and that's not surprising. There was a lot of anger in the necessary. And I broke down my chapters into looking at case studies of the individual, the collective, and the protest. Again, it's an artificial tidying up of my research findings, but and certainly there's an overlap, and the overlap of course, but it certainly gave me time to think about what we mean by the collective and by protest and the individual. So for the 1970s, I looked at the work of Jackie Fleming, so very politicized from the start with her cartooning, and this is her famous iconic little girl. And what I liked was, got excited when I found Vote Girl, created by the suffrage atelier, so there was a nice continuity in that. And although I've put her in the individual bit, she knew the collectives, but she worked on her own cartoons, so she was alongside but not part of any collective. And for the collective, I looked at the work of the Sea Red Women's Workshop, and they were really committed to the 1970s feminist idea of the collective. So they didn't sign their work because it represented the ego. They worked together, shared childcare often, and they produced these posters and leaflets with screen prints, and went to the conferences and put them up on protests. So again, they were protests as well. They were protesting, but they were also working as a collective. So that was interesting. And again, it was a nice link back to the artist collectives, the suffragettes, the atelier, who were doing the same things of making posters to take to rallies and conferences. And for the protest, I was really excited to find this small booklet in the British Library that was produced by the Women's Liberation Workshop for the 1970 Miss World protest in London. And I will, in my talk in the 70s, I'll show you through that, but it used cartooning as the imagery, and it's like a diary zine documenting the experience. And by the way, I've put there's a great documentary on BBC Two iPlayer about Miss World, the protest, and there's also a film called Misbehaviour on BFI. And Jo Robinson, similar to the Sea Red Women's Workshop, to the founders who I spoke to, Prue Stevenson and Susie Mackey, they were art school trained, and Jo Robinson was also trained at art school and also did the same activity of screen printing posters and so on. And then moving in my moving to the 80s, the humour changed to have this this feeling of deprecation, of self-deprecation and deprecation of groups. So it's, how I've interpreted it is the anger of the 70s started moving inward. And briefly, the reason why was, I think if we look back, if we consider feminist politics during the 80s, we kind of perhaps we might be tempted to, you know, imagine there was some kind of lovely sisterhood, but I think as part of that sisterhood was also some quite fierce disagreements and fighting, particularly, you know, amongst ideas and debates around lesbian feminism and around Black feminism that was coming out in the 80s, because this was really being questioned now of what it means to be a woman, and intersectionality was being introduced. But at the same time, feminists were making cartoons about their own feminism, and there's this sense of the humor around, hang on, am I feminist enough, was one of the things. And I think this is a hilarious cartoon by Kath Jackson, who was a really a leading lesbian cartoonist, and very, very big following at the time. And I just love this. She's on this with a knight in shining armor, this rather weedy looking knight on the horse, and she's looking terribly worried. Whatever would my CR group say? So again, CR, consciousness raising group, which was groups of women who came together to share their experiences and you know, gather support and plan protests and so on. So it's this whoever reads that knows what CR group means. So she's putting it to an in crowd. She's this fantasy of riding off on the back of a horse behind a knight. So that's hilarious, I think. And then Kate Charlesworth, who might be here amongst us, but this is a great cartoon she did for Kath Tate. Kath's here, I can see Kath. So it's this was Kate Charlesworth made this cartoon in response to the protesting 3 women who abseiled from the visitors gallery to the floor in the House of Commons to protest against the clause 28, the government clause 28 in May 1988, which said that local authorities should not promote homosexuality as a pretend family relationship. So she's made a pun on that. So again, it's veering really into protest, although Kate Charlesworth worked as an individual, as a collective, and a protester. I think she ticks all those. Whereas Kath Jackson was again affiliated, or knew the collectives, but continued on the whole to work on her own strips. And here's Kath's iconic postcard that the first postcard she did in '83. And again, I put Kath Tate under the collective, but it wasn't a collective like the 70s. It was very much a collective that had grown with the times. So Kath was running a business, but the way she ran it and still runs it is very much shaped by the ideas and the ethos and the philosophy of having a nice time at work and being friends with who you work with. And again, I was very grateful to Kath to be able to look at her archives. So after she began, she started commissioning cartoonists to produce postcards during the 80s. And that was a fascinating talk, and it was a joy to co-edit The Inking Woman with Kath. And of course, Kath was one of the curators of the exhibition, The Inking Woman, and the sponsor of exhibition and book. And this is a cartoon from big up Kath. This is Leslie Rudder. So this was a cartoon that she did for Sour Cream in '84, and Sour Cream was another of the collectives that I looked at. And again, collective, but actually started by 4 cartoons that actually called themselves a collection rather than a collective, because they just wanted to put together cartoons that they probably wouldn't be able to get published anywhere else. So they thought, oh, okay, let's do it. And then it widened out. And again, what I like is this, no, I don't get it much at all, which is being read by a bloke. So although there's this sense of angst and self-questioning and identity crisis going on amongst feminists and amongst lesbians, and showing the hypocrisies, there's still through that a bonding that was taking place, is what I interpret through the humor. So a man might not get the comic, but certainly there would be a growing group of women who would. And finally, the protests. Of course, this was the time of Greenham Common and the peace and peace. So this was, again, it's slightly laughing at themselves. So you hold hands for 10 years, then this big cloud of non-violence comes down and suffocates the military, this sort of slightly self-teasing note about it, the worthiness. And then the 90s, there was this another change. So the 90s, which I have analysed and theorised with Bakhtin's ideas of the grotesque and the carnivalesque. So this is this, for those, I think for me, what comes to mind is the ladettes and this idea of women really, younger women coming up and thinking, not really, a new generation of women growing up and thinking that their feminist foremothers were rather humorless and rather perhaps in many ways, but also a celebration of the body, the women's bodies, of drinking, of smoking, and a celebration of sexuality and desire. So this is Unskinny by Lucy Sweet, who again, I've considered her an individual. So she produced this series of zines or magazines, Unskinny herself. And Rachael House is another. I think Rachel's here with us as well. Hooray. So Rachael House produced Red Hanky Panky zine, a series of these. And again, I really enjoyed this cartoon that was done in the 90s, but would still have relevance today. So Rachel's work has always been about questioning our assumptions around sexuality, and also quite a bit of her work is also questioning her own assumptions around feminism, or one of the cartoons I looked at. So then the collective, there was a new wave of collectives in comics, and one of them, not all comics ones, and Girlfrenzy really was the one that was most comic-ish or cartoonish, but Harpies and Quines was nice, a sort of exciting and again a kind of punchy and, you know, sod it, let's just do it attitude a little bit, or that's what I'm reading into it. And here's one of the cartoons was by Viv Quillin, which is, so again they weren't just cartoons but did include them. So, and what I liked was the title Harpies and Quines. They were thinking of just calling it Harpies, but they felt that was too self-deprecating, because a harpy is an old bag. And so again, if you think what I said about the 1980s that had this sheen of self-deprecation and self-questioning, and then this bold, confident, no, we're not harpies, and they added this and Quines, which is Scottish for an innocent girl. This was a Glasgow-based collective, or cooperative, sorry, that produced a few Harpies and Quines. And then of course I'll have to talk to you in the 90s talk, but they got into trouble with Harpers and Queens for copying, having such a similar title. So that was interesting. And then again, and I hopefully we've got Kate Evans with us here today. I was delighted to talk to Kate about her stories of her experience as a tree protester. And again, it's not overtly a feminist work, but it is overtly a protest work. And what's really lovely is the start where she remembers going to Greenham Common with her mother. So it's this heritage of protest and drawing on ideas around environmental feminism to a certain extent. So up to the most recent bit, really, or most, not that recent still now, but 2000s, I looked at works that had a new professionalism about them. So I looked at works of individuals. I looked at Simone Lear and Sarah Lightman and Katie Green and Paula Knight. And they'd all been, and Asia Alfazi, and they'd all been trained at art school. So again, in a few decades, although lots of the artists had been trained, this was trained often to quite a high level, to MA. And this is Simone Lear, which, so she's not a feminist. However, this is one of my favorite works about Fluffy, because it's so, when I read it, it so clearly speaks to me about parenting, and it's so absurd with this rabbit. So that's delight. But it's also, I was interested in the way she was making reference to this low-tech handmade zine, yet if you look carefully, the quality of the paper, the quality of the printing, the thoughts that have gone into the design are very tutored at quite a high level. And Paula Knight, again, this is again about her experiences of infertility and whether to have a child or not. And again, it's a difficult, quite traumatic subject, and yet she's got this playful punning throughout some of her work. And Asia Alfazi, this is a really interesting a cartoon she has on her website about, again, her work is about identity. So born in Libya and then raised, moving to England and to Scotland. And so she's reflecting on her identity as British with this Libyan family heritage, and also and as a Muslim, growing as a Muslim girl, and the assumptions that people make. So she takes off, it hasn't, okay, anyway. So that's that. And then when I looked at the collective and the protest, I looked at Ladies Comics, now LDC, as the new revived collective. So it's perhaps more of community, but certainly, and Graphic Medicine as another collective, and in a quiet way they're also protesting, so protests can take many forms. And I think also the whole, so I co-founded Ladies Do Comics in 2009, and the whole decade has been, while I've been talking to contributors and reading up on feminist histories and theories, it's made me have conversations with the others in Ladies Do Comics, constantly revising how we run our organization, which is very small, and what our aims and aspirations are for an organization and for ourselves, and what's okay and what's not. And I guess that kind of brings me to the part of my talk where I'm wrapping up and wondering from my research what I found and how it relates to this time of COVID and what we're doing. And one of the very early theories I came across that at the beginning of my PhD, end of my master's, was called anecdotal theory by Jane Gallup. And it's this idea that it's, you know, we academics, we go to these big conferences, but it's often the great ideas come when we're talking in the coffee break. So it's that idea that theorizing and idea making comes in when you least expect it. It comes through anecdotes, through chatting to friends. So it's sort of, I interpret that as friendship as methodology. And I think the more I talk to, there's now 6 of us in Ladies Do Comics committee, and the more that we talk, the more it strengthens my belief system in that. So what can we learn and something, I can't see. So really my finding was, and it seems so obvious every time I see it, and I can't quite believe it, but the platforms for women in comics in this country have been created by feminists and continue to be created by feminists. So it was periodicals, book publishing, exhibitions, and the more that feminists, and it can be feminist men, become into positions of power, the more they can push the ladder, drop the ladder down for other women to climb up and get on that ladder. So one of the things that, again, in conversation with friends, I looked back to my 10 years or so as an illustrator, and it was 90% of commissions came from women, which I know not all women are feminists, but it's still, I think those ones were. So I think it's the way that we can gain power is to create recognition in the humor, I've said, and also the feminist works. I think the humor that's came out of the work I looked at in the 2000s was, it was around work around identity, and work often quite kind of difficulties around identity as women and what we're supposed to do. But there's a sense of the laughter on the other side, and it's really, I've been so shaped by Sixun Clements, who talked about hell and pleasure, and who wrote the hysteric often laughs even as she howls. And I think that's evident that through that, and I think we're seeing a revival of that in humor. And seems to me there is more humor being delivered by women, certainly in stand-up, but also in comics and so on. And the more that we produce in whatever media it is, the more we reinforce a value system. So the more that there's an audience out there that gets us, whether it's a joke or comics work, and that audience grows, the more powerful our group will become. And I think what I learned from looking at these comics was often how humor can be gently thought-provoking. So when I looked at the 80s, when there was that idea of self-deprecation or deprecation in the humour, it was a quiet way of dealing with some difficult debates and conversations, and it sort of smoothed it over or made it a manageable space to talk about and to challenge the status quo. This is things I put. Things get better when things work better when we work together again and again. And it was really interesting looking at how collectives work. Again, it wasn't always, I heard stories of difficulties between members and so on, but actually, and again, it informs how we work together at LDComics, is that idea that it doesn't feel like work when there's more than one of you, and it doesn't feel lonely and isolating. And I think, again, if there's anything we've learned from COVID, it's this: what's the point of being in isolation when it's just so much nicer to do things with other people and do things that people you agree with and get on with. So I think it really, and again on COVID, and again informed by my research, is we need to question assumptions around words and ideas, most obviously around what we mean by success and work, but also things like leadership, because again, that's, you know, I very loudly and proudly call myself director of LDC, but actually I'm constantly called out by the others, and try my hardest to listen, because I learn so much from other people. So there's that element too. Right, okay.